Hi, I'm Scott Grove from Easy Inlay, and have you ever gotten bubbles in your resin work? I'd like to share 12 tips that might help you get clearer, bubble-free castings. In addition to this video, I'll give you a more extensive explanation in a free ebook in a link below. Check that out. So first, you want to pick the right resins. There are a lot of resins out there, from polyester, epoxy, cyanide acrylate, super glue, and each resin is designed to do a different thing. So if you're doing a coating, you want to get a coating, like a bar top. If you're doing a thick casting, you want to get a deep pour resin. So it may sound simple, but you want to make sure you pick the right resin for the right job. The second thing is that all resins are exothermic, meaning when they cure and they cross-link, they heat up. And that heat can expand air in your void. So if you're casting into wood, like an inlay or a river table, that warmed resin can heat the air inside the wood, and that can expand that air and escape, meaning you might do the pour, it might look all clear and clean, you come back 5 minutes later and bubbles appearing from everywhere. That's because the material that you're casting into hasn't been sealed. So you want to seal the void. The other thing is if you're doing an inlay. So if you're adding bits of coffee bean or opal or who knows what you're inlaying, bugs, whatever you want to inlay, you want to make sure that that is sealed also. The same principle. The warmed resin can expand the air inside your inlay product, and that air has to escape somewhere, which create bubbles in the resin. The other thing is that some resins, like urethanes, are very moisture sensitive. So the point is you want to dry your inlay. So again, make sure your inlay is real dry so that doesn't react with the resin. Even metal powders can have moisture on the surface, so you want to dry your material out. You also want to avoid trapped air. So if you're putting, say, a sheet of PowerShell or mother of pearl in an inlay, there can be air underneath in that gap. So you want to sort of avoid trapped air. If you have a lot of particles and if you pour the resin on too quickly, you can get air pockets in there. So you want to make sure you avoid those air pockets. Now, some resins are designed for casting and allow the air bubbles to release, but resins can be thick sometimes, and the bubbles just don't have enough strength, if you will, to sort of rise to the surface. So what you can do is reduce the viscosity of your resin. You can do that by heating the resin up in a double boiler, meaning putting your jars of resin in a bucket of hot water. That will raise the temperature of the resin and lower the viscosity. The lower the viscosity, the thinner the material. The thinner the material, the easier it is for these bubbles to release. Keep in mind, though, if you raise the temperature of the resin, the faster it's typically going to kick. And as a side note, for every 18 degrees you raise the temperature of resin, you cut the cure time in half. That may or may not be a good thing. Another thing you can do is degas, like how we did that cut. Degassing is pulling the bubbles out under vacuum. So you take your mixture, you put it in a vacuum chamber, and then draw a vacuum on it. Under vacuum, the bubbles are enlarged and they float to the top and pop. Really a great way to eliminate bubbles out of your mixture. You want to be very careful about this. It needs additional equipment, and you really know what you're doing so you don't sort of implode or blow yourself up. Pouring your resin into a void can also create bubbles. So it's important to pour usually in a single spot, meaning pour it in one spot and let it flow. Don't be dribbling all over the place because the resin can roll over onto itself and also trap air. You can do a high pour, which means if you pour really high, it gives a very narrow stream and those bubbles can pop as they're sort of dribbling out of your cup. You can actually filter your bubbles out, get a paint filter and pour that through either into your void or just pour it into another cup. That literally will filter out larger bubbles. You can heat it with a heat gun as you're pouring, or take air and blow air over the pour stream, and that will pop the air bubbles. In addition, if you're doing a thick pour, you might want to consider doing multiple layers, meaning pour a layer, 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch. Give it time for those air bubbles in that layer to kind of rise to the top, and then you pop them, and then you pour another layer on top. The other thing is when you're pouring layers, Or if you're working, for example, with UV cure resin, you want the resin to rest. Just give it time to relax and give it time for those air bubbles to work its way out. Because many times, if it's UV resin, you want to hit it with light, that will cure it. You just want to give time for the air bubbles to release. Also, sometimes those bubbles can come to the surface and kind of just stay there, right? So you want to release the surface tension on that resin to pop those bubbles. So you can do that with a heat gun. You can do it with a torch, although be careful which resin you're working with. Some resins have flammable solvents in there. So I don't like to work with a torch. Heat gun is just fine, although keep in mind the air from the heat gun may push the resin around. So if you're trying to work with some colors or pigments, that may or may not be a good thing. You can simply use air, an air gun or a canned air to sort of agitate the surface, if you will, and that will pop those bubbles. Or you can spray solvent on there. So a little DNA, denatured alcohol or acetone in a fine mist, that will hit the surface and break the surface tension and release those air bubbles. Another thing you can do is over pour your resin. So if you're filling a void, make a dam on either side with, say, silicone caulk or tape, and pour and overfill your void. So any bubbles that are sort of migrating up, they're going to migrate up. Maybe they don't make it to the top, but they'll make it above the surface that you're going to cut back to. That's a great little trick to sort of get a clear casting. And lastly, you can do pressure casting on smaller objects. If you have a pressure pot, you can put your casting in there and put it under pressure. And that kind of works the reverse of a vacuum chamber. So instead of taking those little bubbles and making them big, it's taking any bubbles that are in there and compressing them down to a microscopic, invisible sort of layer. It's very much like opening a ginger ale bottle, right? There's no bubbles in there. You open it up and these bubbles appear from nowhere. Well, think of that in reverse. Sort of takes those bubbles, puts it under pressure, and makes them invisible. So be using one or a combination of these tips will really help you get a bubble-free casting. We have picked the right resin, sealing the void, sealing the inlay, drying the inlay, avoid trapped air, reducing the viscosity, degas, properly pouring, letting the resin rest, releasing the surface tension, overfilling, or pressure casting. So there's 12 tips to give you a better casting. I hope this helps. Again, check out the link. I've written this all out in more detail. And happy casting. Thanks for watching.